Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about the impact of culture on virtual teams. Culture is a complex characteristic of a group that includes its knowledge, its beliefs, its art, its morals, its laws, its customs, and any other capabilities or habits acquired by a person as a result of being part of that group. Personality could be substituted for culture and person for group to define the characteristic of a person known as personality. So at a group level, we have culture, and at an individual level, we have personality. And many aspects of culture or personality are involved in solving problems: law, custom, morals, beliefs, and how we organize our knowledge. So we have to look at managing trust across cultures. Market globalization results in an increasing tendency for the world to act as one global system, with corporations having worldwide presence. While advances in travel and communication technologies have made globalization a reality, they force businesses to address cultural issues as well, for both communications and management techniques. Intercultural communications is the process of sending and receiving messages between people whose cultural backgrounds lead them to interpret verbal and nonverbal signs differently. Before any business action can be completed, there must be communication and interaction between the participants. When the participants are from different cultures, the messages and interactions between them can be misinterpreted. Due to the global nature of modern virtual teams, expect that many team members will be in other countries, of other cultures, and may interpret communication content differently than the message was intended to communicate. Our interactions with other people are affected by our knowledge of particular persons, classes of people, or societies as a whole. The less we know about them, the more risk for misunderstanding. Also, culture and personality concern attitudes about technology. These attitudes concern ways we manipulate objects in order to experience a desired end state. So, such misinterpreted messages, because they're centered on negotiating business transactions, can adversely affect the trust levels of team members. The upshot of it all is that cultures create a behavioral environment. The cultural factors that can impact behavior on global virtual teams include language, values, and nonverbal communication. A cultural faux pas can be embarrassing. It can be an embarrassing experience for professional managers. The best intentions can be undermined with negative consequences for the team. The good news is that coaching and training can reconcile cultural differences and harmonize team operation. So let's focus on cultural factors that might influence the operation of a global virtual team. Hofstede, who we will be reviewing in this lecture in more detail, gives this technical definition of culture. A culture, according to Hofstede, is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes members of one group from another. So we have the mental patterns specific to an individual, and that's that person's personality. We have the mental patterns specific to a group, and that is the culture that that group of people have. And then we have the mental patterns that are universal to all of us, and that is human nature. Culture is deeply ingrained in each person. It is encoded in us by the age of 10. Much of culture is invisible. Its fundamental values and beliefs that are hard to change and may be difficult even to observe. Two social scientists are preeminent in the field of cultural analysis for business purposes. The first is Hofstede and the second is Hall. So now it's time to shift our focus to the cultural factors affecting global virtual teams, beginning from a theoretical perspective, and then we'll end at the practical level. We'll look specifically at the effects of cultures and values on virtual team behaviors. Let's start with Hall. Hall proposes that culture has three dimensions. High context and low context cultures is his first dimension. Time orientation is his second dimension. And space territoriality is his third dimension. High context and low context cultures are the first dimension for Hall's model of cultural effect or impact on business. He contends that in some cultures, messages are explicit so that words carry the information. These are low context cultures. In contrast, in high context cultures, there is more information contained in the context and less in the actual words. In high context cultures, the wording is only one part of the message. The context is also part of the message. In low context cultures, only the wording is the message. And some lean media are better suited for low context cultures, for example, email. High context cultures, such as those in Asia or South America, emphasize nonverbal cues and personal relationships in their knowledge exchanges. They generally do not trust a message sender until they have established a personal relationship. In contrast, low context cultures, such as Europe and North America, emphasize verbal content. Moreover, they trust a message sender until that person or entity has proven themselves unreliable. In high context cultures, building trust must satisfy more conditions. Social relationships are usually a prerequisite to professional relationships. This is because high context cultures are collectivist and value group associations more highly than individual achievement. Time orientation is Hall's second dimension. In some cultures, time is linear and absolute, and punctuality and meeting deadlines are stressed. In other cultures, time is flexible, so that meeting times are a suggestion and time estimates are as flexible as the deadlines that result from them. In flex time cultures, people tend to work on many activities in parallel. In hard time cultures, people tend to do tasks sequentially. And of course, this dimensional difference can lead to conflicts. Time is important to cultures both in terms of orientation and in terms of literal minutes, hours, days, and months. Americans, Canadians, Australians, and Western Europeans tend to be much more conscious of time, and we all tend to schedule our time to the minute. This is hard time also known as monochronic time perspective. Other cultures, such as those of Latin America, Asia, and India, tend to be more relaxed about time and scheduling. This is flex time, and it's also known as a polychronic time perspective. So we have a monochronic time perspective in Western Europe and America and Canada and Australia, and we have a polychronic time perspective in much of the rest of the world. Hall's third dimension in his cultural model of the impact of culture on business is space territoriality. Space is an important type of nonverbal communication among cultures. In some cultures, personal space requires a greater distance, arm's length or more. In others, people require much less space, and this can make their more territorial teammates uncomfortable when co-located. This dimension also extends to ownership. Those cultures that need less space also have less regard for ownership. Team members with a cultural need for more space also tend to place more emphasis on security. In America, the land of supersized meals, Suburbans, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, bigger is better, and people value their own personal space. This is not the case in many other cultures. This can lead to conflicts on global virtual teams. Now let's change gears and consider the other major cultural model, the one developed by Hofstede. The original Hofstede model had 4 dimensions. The more modern Hofstede model proposes that culture has a 5th dimension, future. The first dimension in Hofstede's model is power orientation. The second is relationship orientation, and we'll be going over these in more detail in the next slide. The third is the masculinity-femininity dimension. The fourth is uncertainty orientation. And the fifth is the future or pragmatism orientation. A sixth dimension has been added by Hofstede in 2010, and that is indulgence. Hofstede does not have his own data for this new 6th dimension, but bases this addition on the work of Bulgarian scholar Michael Minkoff. Indulgent cultures generally exhibit a willingness to realize their impulses and desires with regard to enjoying life and having fun. So, power orientation is one of the dimensions, and we'll start with that one in Hofstede's model. This is the emotional distance between managers and their subordinates. It's the extent subordinates accept the unequal distribution of power. High power cultures tend to have more autocratic management, and examples are in countries like Russia, China, and Indonesia. Team members from high power cultures are unlikely to disagree with their managers or team policies. They are also more comfortable with an autocratic or paternalistic decision-making system, which can be problematic in virtual teams. In contrast, low power orientation cultures are more egalitarian and don't accept large disparities in power. Now, we've got a lot of data for Hofstede's model, and so we'll take a look from time to time at some of his country summaries in regards to these various dimensions. So let's start now with going out to the internet. So here we have the power distance definition, and we can see some of the traits for a high power distance, and that is those in power have privileges, whereas in low power distance, the system strives to make sure everyone has equal rights. And inequality is the norm. Everyone has their specific place. In a high power distance culture, in a low power distance culture, inequality is minimized and there's no set hierarchy. In a low power distance culture, there's a respect for individuality. In a high power distance culture, there's respect for authority. The political organizations in high power distance cultures tend to be military, autocratic, and oligarchic, while in low power distance cultures, the government is based on a majority. The big difference between them politically is there's a power struggle in high power distance cultures, whereas there's power sharing in low power distance cultures. And the other contrasts are very interesting in this particular dimension, as well as the other ones. And again, we'll be visiting these throughout the lecture tonight. So, which culture would more readily embrace the decentralized knowledge networks of virtual teams? Well, probably the low power distance cultures. They have short organizational pyramids rather than the tall hierarchical pyramids. They're not organized around a military, autocratic, or oligarchical structure, but more on an egalitarian structure. So we might say that a low power distance culture would more readily embrace decentralized knowledge networks that are common on virtual teams. Okay, the next dimension is the relationship orientation. In some cultures, people are highly individualistic and think of themselves as individuals rather than part of a group. Individuals stress freedom, privacy, personal time, and personal challenges. They tend to be more assertive and confrontational in work settings. Wealthy nations tend to be more individualistic. Group harmony is more important to collectivists, and they value loyalty to the group and group protection over freedom and privacy. Cultures that measure high in Hofstede's collectivism index value status quo, harmony, and collaboration with known associates. In addition, such cultures emphasize social relationships and indirect communications. Hofstede's characteristic of individualism versus collectivism is also known as Hall's low context versus high context culture. Hall's low context culture corresponds to Hofstede's individualistic culture, while a high context culture corresponds to Hofstede's collectivist culture. In high context cultures, people augment verbal communications with nonverbal messages and with cues from the social environment. Even in their verbal communications, such cultures are more indirect. In contrast, low context cultures, here denoted as individualistic, pay less attention to nonverbal cues or social setting, as an individualistic culture is more direct in verbal communications. Moreover, individualistic cultures strive to reach decisions more quickly They value confrontation and problem solving, and they negotiate impersonally. These differences can result in misunderstandings with team members from a high context culture. Collectivists are reluctant to work with strangers on virtual teams, so a special effort must be made to create friendships with them. The third dimension of Hofstadt's model is masculinity and femininity. In a masculine culture, achievement and success are paramount, while in a feminine culture, caring for others and quality of life are most important. Team members from a feminine culture prefer consensus management, while in contrast, those from masculine cultures prefer decisive management. Rewards in feminine cultures are distributed equally to the group. In masculine cultures, they are distributed according to perceived contribution. The fourth dimension in Hofstadt's model is uncertainty orientation. This deals with the avoidance of uncertainty or ambiguity. People from cultures that avoid uncertainty prefer that rules are set and unambiguous. They tend to stay with a bad situation because of the uncertainty in leaving the bad situation for an unknown situation. They also need more explanation and proof for actions. A culture adverse to uncertainty usually attempts to minimize uncertainty with strict laws and rules. In addition, cultures averse to uncertainty are not tolerant of multiple points of view. For them, there is one truth and they have it. The fifth dimension of Hofstadt's model is future orientation. This is delaying gratification so that you can have a better future. Save what you have today so that you'll have a better tomorrow. It's also known as pragmatism or the pragmatist orientation. Team members from a future-oriented culture stress savings, perseverance, and persistence. Team members with a present or past orientation instead place emphasis on tradition, social obligation, and current gratification. Future-oriented teams have a longer-term perspective. Present or past-oriented team members have a conservative historic or a short-term point of view. So now that we've gone over the major aspects of Hofstadt's theory, let's see it in practice. And we'll first look at his tool that is used to compare cultures. So I've already preloaded this in my browser. And the link is in the slides tonight. You can also just search for it on Google. So let's take a look and we'll compare Argentina to America. Wrong one. There we go. Okay, so we select Argentina, and we can see the ratings that are given to Argentina in the various dimensions in the Hofstadt model. You can see the one thing that really stands out is Argentinians are averse to uncertainty or risk. They also have a fairly high indulgence where they are willing to make time to enjoy life. So we'll select a comparison country, and let's select United States as a comparison. So we can see that in terms of indulgence, Argentina and United States are very similar. Their future orientation is low, likewise very similar in both countries. They are more concerned with the present or the past than they are the future. Uncertainty avoidance is a big difference. America is neutral on uncertainty, whereas Argentina, people from Argentina, tend to avoid it. Both of them are about the same in the masculinity rating. Here's another big difference: individualism. Americans are much more individualistic than Argentinians. And we went over a little bit on how that can impact a team. We're going to go over it a lot more in the slides later on this evening. And power distance, they're about the same. Now, one of your, the country you'll be dealing with in your group project is China. So let's look at the difference between China and you all here in the United States. So you can see there are four areas where there's substantial differences. China is a very different culture than the United States. In China, there's a lot of respect for authority and the boss, and that's not true in the United States. China is a collectivist country, whereas the United States is an individualistic country. These are two areas that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and conflict. They're roughly the same in the masculinity dimension, and the Chinese have less aversion to risk. They're more willing to accept risk than people in the United States. Pragmatism, what we were calling future orientation, China has a very strong future orientation, and the United States has a very strong present or past orientation. Chinese are not very indulgent, whereas Americans are willing to take time out to smell the roses and enjoy life. So think about this as we go over the rest of our cultural lecture this evening, and think about how you might put that into your project plan, because you're going to be dealing with a manufacturer in China in that group project. Okay, let's take a break. One other thing I want to say is we were looking at Hofstadt's Cultural Index on a web browser on my PC. There's also an iPhone app for Hofstadt's model. Just go to the iStore or the App Store, and you can search for Hofstadt's model and download and install it. And it's pretty handy if you have it on your iPhone. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll continue with culture. Thank you.